Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar Managing Traffic Management System Assets and Resources that will showcase the TRB Workshop number 102 results. My name is Nilu Parvinashtiani and I'll be helping with facilitation of today's webinar. This webinar is hosted by the National Operations Center of Excellence, also known as NOCLO. So just a quick reminder, if you don't know us already, we offer resources to support the transportation system management and operations community. So on your screen right now, on the right corner, you see a NOCLO useful links box. Feel free to browse through those links to get more familiar with our resources, news, and case studies. In that area, you can also see webinar links, which are two helpful resources related to the topic of this webinar, as well as a download pod, where you can download the webinar slides from today's presentation, as well as a summary of the TRB workshop that was held. So a few other logistics that I wanted to share is that we are recording this webinar, and the recording along with the presentation will be shared on the on-demand learning section of the NOCLO website. The attendee forms are on listen-only mode by default, but please stay engaged by using the question discussion pod for any comments or any questions that you have during the webinar. We have dedicated time in our agenda at the end for a question and answer session. So please, just as those questions come to your mind during the presentations, type them in the question discussion pod, and then our moderator will read each of those questions out loud one at a time, and will pose it to the panel. So that is all I had with my housekeeping items, and with that, I will hand it over to our moderator, John Obenberger, to start us off. John.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is titled Managing Traffic Management Systems, Assets, and Resources. This webinar will explore not only the what and why of managing TMS assets and resources, but it will also highlight the summary of the dialogue and feedback and results that were obtained at the TRB Workshop number 1002, which took place in this past January during the virtual TRB annual meeting. So we wanted to make sure that as a part of this webinar, we highlighted the great feedback that we received from over 250 participants during that workshop. I would also like to thank not only the speakers for today's workshop, but also our webinar, but also the co-sponsors of the actual TRB workshop that took place. We had the lead committee from TRB for the sponsorship of the workshop was the ITS committee, and Krieger is the chair of that committee. We also had 5 other TRB committees and subcommittees that co-sponsored the workshop, and we'll go through a detailed list of those later in the workshop. But I also wanted to highlight the co-sponsorship and partnership with the AASHTO Committee on Transportation Systems Operations ITS Work Group, the TMC Pooled Fund Study, IBTTA, ASSACAP, and the Ertigo Innovation Platform for Traffic Management 2.0 Work Group. They were all sponsors and involved in the planning and conducting of the workshop at TRB. Like was mentioned, we're going to cover in the next 2 hours 4 framing presentations. They're going to sort of set the context of traffic asset management and also some of the key activities that have been conducted in industry to support those activities. We also will cover and highlight the feedback that we received during the TRB workshop, where we had breakout groups, virtual breakout groups, on the topics, and we asked people to take a look at and provide feedback on the key issues agencies should consider, successful practices, and what existing resources are they using, or what may need to be developed to help them as they look at developing and maintaining an inventory of their assets for their traffic management system, what may be needed to monitor and assess the condition of those assets, and practices with reporting on the condition and performance of their TMS assets. To get started, I'd also like to reference the summary that came out of the workshop and the next steps with activities that the co-sponsors and the TRB ITS committee are going to engage in and hopefully advance with other volunteers over the next couple of years. So we'll have Greg Krieger. We'll cover that at the end of the webinar as well to give you an idea of the next steps of the work that we're going to try to pursue in partnership with all the volunteers and the sponsors for the activities that we have planned based on what we heard at the workshop and what people are willing to volunteer and help with. So with that, I will introduce the first speaker, Mr. Pete Marshall. He's a global international expert on traffic management systems, and Pete is going to cover traffic management system assets and resources. Pete?
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. So to start to frame the discussion of TMS assets and resources, let's first look at a definition of asset management. So asset management can be thought of as the strategic and systematic process of operating, maintaining, and improving the condition and the performance of physical and logical assets. And the word strategic implies that the process is purposeful and well planned. And furthermore, asset management describes the process and the activities focused on engineering and cost analysis based on asset data and related information, for example, repair costs, maintenance costs, and replacement costs. So what is the value proposition for managing TMS assets? Well, asset management creates processes and integrates the condition of TMS assets and resources in decision-making involving the management, the maintenance, the preservation, the repair, and the replacement of those assets. And with those processes in place, agencies can do a number of things, including establishing, achieving, and sustaining a desired state of good repair, managing assets life cycle to achieve desired performance with lower overall costs, improving the performance of the TMS assets and the overall system, and they're able to efficiently allocate resources, for example, preventive maintenance efforts, repairs, or the replacement of assets. So what TMS assets and resources should agencies manage? How do you decide? Well, the first step is to identify assets, so for instance, subsystems, components, devices, and resources, such as policies, designs, manuals, procedures, et cetera. Decide which ones to manage based on your specific TMS and your agency priorities. In other words, identify what assets you need to keep your system functional. And then you would identify performance measures, KPIs, and expectations for those assets. And it's also important to frame your desired condition and performance levels for different types and different tiers of assets, and then identify those required life cycle activities such as performance monitoring or repairs specific to each type of asset. And finally, identify common activities, data, and information needs, resource importance, and the value of the asset. So that kind of begs the question of what is an asset and what assets should agencies try to manage. Each agency, of course, is going to have their own priorities. And this slide shows some examples. So a typical TMS whether it's a regional or a statewide system, or if it's oriented towards freeway management or arterial control, is going to have a number of physical assets tied to it, including individual components as well as subsystems. And some of those examples are shown in the orange boxes. But TMSs also have extensive logical assets, some of examples of which are shown in the green boxes, which can't be overlooked. Things like operational strategies, functions, actions, and even services that a TMS might provide, like a data feed to a partner agency would qualify as an asset, and it should be managed and maintained accordingly as well. Other examples might be signal timing patterns, planned diversion routes, incident response plans, all of which may change based on current conditions, and they need to be maintained and updated. Now, all of these assets are not going to have the same support requirements, so best practice to consider is to consider categorizing and establishing performance measures for different tiers or different types of assets based on similarity and priority. So it's a good practice to try and group similar assets into tiers with similar requirements and capabilities, and establish performance measures and targets for each tier or type of asset. Then next, establish the desired operational conditions for each asset tier or type. Identify maintenance and repair resource needs. Establish benchmarks for performance and downtime for different asset tiers. And finally, identify and obtain resources needed to ensure those assets meet performance expectations. And this slide is an example of what we mean by classifying assets into tiers or types. And this is just an example, so it might not match what, what your agency would do, but how assets might be classified are based on a variety of materials, such as a variety of factors such as criticality, maintenance needs, overall life cycle cost, difficulty to replace, or your own specific agency goals and objectives. And we'll hear more about that from Dan in the next session. So let's talk about the data and information necessary to support managing assets. For each asset type, a unique data set will need to be collected and maintained, and to get started, the following steps are probably needed. So for each asset type, identify the data needed to maintain the asset, assess the asset's performance, and carry out its function. Next, establish that data collection frequency and the requirements, for example, the accuracy or the format or the methodology to collect it. Verify which data and information is needed to assess condition of the assets, and then undertake a complete inventory of assets and resources, and at the same time establish the collection frequency and methodology for updating that inventory. And then collect, compile, archive, analyze, and manage that data from the inventory. And finally, all that collected data, the use of it, the storage, and the archiving, all those procedures should be captured in the TMS's data management plan. So let's frame managing assets based on conditions and performance. A typical process might involve first identifying preventive maintenance, replacement, repairs, and resources needed to meet the desired conditions and performance expectations for each asset tier or type. Determine the resources that are necessary to meet those expectations. And it also involves planning for and obtaining the funding and other resources needed to meet the expectations, and the allocation of those resources, again, with the idea of meeting the performance expectations and KPIs, and then tracking any work performed, the frequency, the cost of repairs for maintenance or replacements, and finally integrating asset conditions, performance of maintenance costs and actions into the planning to replace, upgrade, maintain, or retire assets, or the entire TMS itself. So once the asset management processes are in place, ongoing activities will consist of monitoring, collecting, compiling, managing, and reporting on the asset conditions. So there'll be an ongoing effort to collect and update performance measures and accuracy. Data collection frequency should be established, Requirements for data collection, compilation, storage, and management must be determined. And the monitoring assets in real time to assess the performance and reporting asset conditions is critical to the process. And finally, actions must be initiated to achieve the desired performance for specific assets, for example, repair, maintain, or replace. All right, so to wrap up this first session, let's talk about how agencies can use and what we've discussed for TMS asset condition and performance information. So asset management requires monitoring and reporting asset conditions and performance in real time, resulting in actionable information. And actions are initiated and resources assigned in response to the measured and documented conditions. And day-to-day activities are prioritized based on impact and need. The process also allows prioritization and allocation of funding for TMSs for repairs and maintenance. They could also influence agency or regional operation plans such as TMO plans. And then the incorporation of management of TMS assets into the overall management planning and programming conducted by the larger agency as a whole. And finally, integration of the management of TMS assets into the planning for the next generation of an agency's TMS. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan McKasick for a deeper dive into developing and maintaining an inventory of TMS assets.
Thank you, Pete. I appreciate it. So again, this is Dan McKasick from Parsons, and I'm going to cover the topic of really developing and maintaining a TMS inventory. Pete did a great job of framing and discussing, the specifics of the assets and which assets you should worry about. So you need to compile the list of the assets, and it included, those things about, say, there are TMS field components or ITS field components like cameras, message signs, vehicle detectors, traffic signal controllers. It includes other things like maybe road weather information systems or even edge devices. Communications equipment is part of this. It includes, your switches, layer 1, layer 2 switches, antennas, but it also includes the media, right? The fiber optic cable itself, the coax or twisted pair cable if that's in place. But it also includes your typical transportation management center components like video walls and servers and firewalls, and it includes software too. The software that's used to manage the whole system, as well as firmware. So those are all things that really need to be thought about in the inventory. We need to establish a list of resources where we're going to get this information from. And there's a lot of stuff that was mentioned earlier and then that I just talked about. Where do we get all that information? How do we collect it? How do we document the inventory itself? What tools do we use to do it? How do we maintain that inventory? And how do we monitor and manage it? And that's what I'll be discussing in more details over these next slides. So a little bit about the inventorying of the assets. So first, what are your resources? It could be plans, design plans, as-built, specifications. Maybe there's existing databases where this information exists, and that's certainly true of the case when there's software that's talking to a piece of equipment. There's often a database in that software for it. So unfortunately, the task is that typically these things exist in many places, and we just got to find out what those are, list them, and start digging into it. We need to identify the assets and categorize them by component, device, subsystem, and then we need to determine the information that we're going to gather in archive. What kind of condition data are we going to get? What are the accuracy requirements for the devices? What is the product information? Make, model, serial number. What's the other product information? When was it installed last? When was it purchased? That's valuable information to know. If a component is 10 years old, it may be very much at the end of life or past it. We need to know that information. And then other resources like policies, procedures, operating manuals, training manuals, trouble ticket systems, That can all be tools that can be used to help things. For example, in your trouble ticket system, you might be able to glean that particular device has failed many times, and that is information that we would definitely want to know. Moving on to issues that we should consider in developing that inventory. So how are we going to create that inventory? What's the scope of work? What is the support that we need and the funding that we need? We need people to do this. Many times there are people that are very busy. We need tools that are going to do this. Do we have existing tools that'll work? Are they insufficient, or do we need to get new ones? Are we going to put things in a central configuration management tool? Maybe it's cloud-based. Maybe it's maybe it's a more distributed approach. After we figure out what we need to do, then we're going to get our support for resources, support for funding, and then we're going to develop, this configuration management plan. And then lastly, we're going to identify the tools we need. Maybe we have them, maybe we don't, maybe we need to obtain them. And then, data considerations for our inventory. Some of these things, there's a lot about the requirements for the inventory. For example, things like accuracy. And how do we keep data integrity and accuracy? That was a big topic that was discussed with many agencies. Often inventories are created, but then over time it's not maintained, and then the information starts to get stale and old, and what do we do to spot check the accuracy of the information that we have? We need to have data for performance reports. We need to understand whether there's limitations to any of the information. Maybe there's some privacy and information or data in there that we don't want to be archived, or we need to flag it in a certain way that we don't want it to be distributed to others. Are we going to do things in a centralized manner, following certain processes and protocols? We talked to various DOTs that have multiple districts. Some of the individual districts maintain inventory separately, but then they're rolled up into maybe a centralized repository. How should that be handled? So these are some of the data considerations that we need to worry about. Talk about the topic. Pete mentioned this, the need to try to put our assets into different tiers, and that helps us with prioritizing. It helps us with funding. So it helps us understand how to handle condition and performance reports. It helps us with prioritizing asset management activity. It helps us with prioritizing budget. And it really also relates to understanding who needs which components, why they need those components, and why they need to be, kind of categorized as more important than others. Here's this discussion of, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And tier 1 is kind of that high priority. So it really relates to understanding what is the impact if that device or system component failed. So, for example, I have a major communication node in the field, and it is connecting me to 50 different devices. I have a major piece of software that really is the brains of my whole operation, and it really tells me how to monitor and respond to things. Those things would be thrown into that tier 1 category, because if we lose them, they're too impactful to lose. Tier 2, it's important, but we can maybe live without it for a certain period. Maybe that's a message sign or something like that, or traffic signal. So we would put those into, maybe tier 2. Maybe a vehicle detector or camera would be in tier 2. And then tier 3, it's a beneficial asset. It's not a critical asset. Maybe this is a road weather information system device, or maybe it's a backup system. We know we needed to get it repaired in case we have a failure, but it's not, fully necessary that it's done this second or repaired this second. And let's talk a little bit about challenges with maintaining that inventory. So, obviously it's roles and responsibilities and staffing and resources. People are very busy. How do we get the commitment of people? How do we get new resources if we need them? And one thing that was mentioned to us as well, how do we get those staff to understand and believe that the task of maintaining this inventory is an important task and that it needs to be a continuous effort? We need documentation like configuration management plans. We need data management plans. We need guidance documents. If they don't exist, we're going to have to prepare them and we're going to have to maintain them. That's important as well. And we need to understand the challenges and how this inventory links to other actions like other maintenance actions, other systems, resources, and databases. How does it relate and link into trouble ticket systems and MOMS as an example? And then opportunities to use the inventory, right? So now that we have the inventory, now we can have some dashboarding and reporting and analytics on what's going on. How are things performing? Are things, is a certain device type, is it up 99% of the time or is it up 60% of the time? Now that we have the inventory, we can start to measure, right? We need to look at, how we'll be able to measure what is the life cycle cost analysis that can be done based on this information. What are those asset management activities that need to do that and what are the sources for that? This helps us with planning resources and budgeting. Now that we have dashboards, we can see that, for example, we see that we replace 20 new CCTV cameras every year. So now that we know that, we now understand the costs that we should be attributing each year in our budgets for asset management. And that's based on using real-time uptime reports as well as historical reports combined together. And then a little bit on successful practices. Here's just some examples. Georgia DOT has done a great job with measuring device health, setting up, SLAs to make sure devices are up at a certain level. So I'd urge everyone to look at some of the best practices there from Georgia DOT, Nevada DOT, some great information on data collection and management plans, GIS mapping used in our inventory. SunGuide in Florida DOT has some great dashboard reporting for ITS asset management. Maryland DOT has some great information on the inventorying of TMS devices. And Wisconsin DOT, how to use COTS software to compile inventory of TMS assets. Some other resources, there's some great resources and research that's been done by NCHRP, USDOT. There continues to be a lot more research being done on this topic as well. So we'd urge you to look at these, which includes the NCHRP report on improving asset inventory and asset tracking, the other NCHRP report on transportation asset management programs. Take a look at the USDOT report for asset management data collection for supporting decision processes. And lastly, the FHW report on configuration management. So I will turn it over to Les Jacobson to talk about monitoring and assessing TMS assets.
Thank you, Dan. So just to do kind of a mid-presentation check-in. So Peter kind of provided the framework and the overall discussion of TMS assets, and then Dan just did a really good job of explaining what the importance is of an inventory, how you'd use it. I'm going to take the next step. Once you have that inventory, how do you then manage your assets and assess them? And then I'll turn it over to John, who will talk about reporting to give kind of the full life cycle of asset management. So what I'll be doing is really talking about some of the issues that you want to consider, and I'm framing these in questions. So these are things that an agency would need to think about. They're not necessarily the same for every agency, so you need to take a look and consider what's going to be right for your situation and your system. But some of the things that need to be considered is how you access and then use that asset data. So what data are you collecting? Dan talked about that. How often do you collect that data? What data is archived? So there's going to be an awful lot of data that's out there. You may choose to archive everything. There may be some things that aren't as important. And probably even more important than that is who's going to have access to that data? What data will be accessed? Who will be able to do it? What levels of permissions do you want to allow for that? Especially when you think about not only people within your group or agency, but are you going to make that data available to external parties, other agencies, things like that? And it's really important to think about the risks that you might be able to kind of anticipate or measure against when you look at the assets and how actively you monitor those assets. So are there things that you can see that are really going to help you assess or to manage your risks, and consider that in how you monitor and assess your assets. Both Pete and Dan talked about the data that's used to monitor the condition and performance of each asset. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well, but it's really important to think about those performance metrics. And finally, what are the thresholds used when you're looking to monitor the condition? When does it mean you need some sort of response? Dan had talked about that, but it's really important to make sure that you think about what that's going to work for you for each asset type, and particularly which tier that asset type is in. I mentioned the importance of archiving. Once you archive, of course, you have to manage. Actually, once you collect that data, you have to manage it, and you have to decide how to use it. So there's a lot of things to consider there. I'm not going to go through all of these, but where it's stored. Is it stored in the cloud? Do you want to keep it in your own on your own servers? How are you going to manage that archive as you get more and more data? And then are you going to monitor this in the same manner for all your assets and all your asset tiers? And finally, another, I think, really important thing is what requirements may be different for assets whose operating conditions and status need to be monitored and managed in real time. So there are some assets that you may need to monitor in real time. Traffic signals might be one where you want to know the health of that controller at all times. Then when you monitor it, we've talked about what data are you going to collect, but it's really important to think about what data is needed to manage that asset overall. So we talked a little bit about what are the indicators that might be there that you need to take action on. So overall, it's not only when you take action on these assets, but anything that you need to do to manage that asset. Also, what data may be needed to monitor the condition of each asset. So you might have a threshold for when it needs action, but you probably want to see how that particular metric is kind of moving over time, even if it doesn't go beyond a threshold. And then to think about all of these measures and thresholds and requirements that are appropriate to all your different assets and the use of those assets. When we think about managing the data and using the data, Pete mentioned the importance of a data management plan. So as you're looking into this, one of the questions to ask is, do I have a data management plan? If not, it's probably a good idea to develop one. Same thing with configuration management. Just like in software and managing the configuration of software, it's important to manage the configuration of assets so that you know what needs to be replaced, what can be like-for-like replacement, those sorts of things. Also, who's going to be responsible? Where is the data archived? Is it in different locations? So some of the questions that we asked earlier, but it's also important when you're thinking about how to manage the use of the data, those same questions again. And then what resources are used to manage that use. So you have the assets, those resources, if you will, and then what resources are you going to use to manage that data? So are you going to bring in a full-fledged asset management system? Do you have fewer assets and different requirements so that you can use something a little similar to that? And how are you going to purchase that? Is it going to be COTS? Is it going to be developed? All of those things are important to consider as well. And then we've talked about performance measures. It's really important to think about that for each asset class and each asset tier. So what are the measures that you're going to use because they're a tier 1 asset? And there may be, and there's probably some overlay between the tier of the asset and what the specific asset is. So a traffic signal may be a tier 1 asset, but another tier 1 asset like your central system, you're probably going to have some measures that are different and some measures that are similar. And it's really important to make sure all of this links back to your asset management plan and what the goals of your system are. You want to be able to make sure that those measures also link back to the goals of the agency. And then finally, what is it that people are going to be wanting to see about the condition of your assets? So the measures should be able to provide information for people who are interested in the performance and to provide that information. And that's going to be different audiences. Different audiences are going to be interested in different aspects of asset performance. So it's really important, just like any other performance measures, it's important that the measures are specific, they're quantifiable, they're measurable, you can actually obtain those, that whoever's going to be looking at them, that it's easy to understand. So there's some that will be used by people who don't have an awful lot of technical background. There'll be some that has very deep technical background and want to get into the weeds. Just make sure that you can meet the needs of the various users that are there, and also make sure that you can do it within your budget constraints, within your time constraints, and you're not trying to collect too much or collect too fine a level of detail to make it so that your asset management becomes too difficult to do. So these are just some examples you probably want to think about, condition, and there's a lot of ways you can quantify or qualify condition. Health is typically, is it up, is it operating, is it operating reliably? In other words, how much downtime do you have? What's your mean time between failure or mean time between repairs for a particular asset? And then what type of malfunction are you seeing? How often does that occur? Does that track to a particular asset type, a particular manufacturer, a particular age? All of those things can help with determining when you're getting to the end of your life cycle and how you need to deal with that, which has a big implication on cost. It's really important to try and figure out what that optimal life cycle is for a particular asset. So some of the successful practices, typically anymore, people are using COT software. It's much more cost effective. Minnesota DOT is a good example of that. Also, there's generally, I think, new asset management systems are all GIS based. It really helps for being able to know exactly where a particular asset is. New York State DOT is a good example of doing that. Also, asset management software programs that manage and report on all of your TMS assets and conditions, and PennDOT is a good example of that. Dan mentioned that GDOT has a good asset management system. They also have the device monitoring and maintenance contract, as he mentioned, with some SLAs. So they're a good one to look to for those sorts of things. And then database and software that manage TMS inventory and condition information from Washington State DOT. So this is just an example of how you can link asset data to goals, performance measures, and thresholds. So your goal might be to maximize the reliability, efficiency, and life cycle costs of ITS assets, and that can link directly to objectives, performance measures, and thresholds. So one objective might be 90% of assets will operate with 90% of their life expectancy. So 90% of the assets that you have will live up to 90% of what you expect their life cycle to be. And then it's also important to link the asset data to condition monitoring or performance reporting. So in that case, you may have an asset like a device database communication, and it's got certain attributes like device, make and model, like system up and down time, temperature, fan speed. There might be a whole bunch of things that are important there. And then each of those has a particular frequency of data collection. Some things aren't measured very often or checked very often, like the device make and model. But other things you may want to check more often, like the power supply, and making sure that you've got power up. So finally, there's a lot of resources available for monitoring and assessing TMS assets. The District of Columbia has a good document on monitoring and maintaining ITS assets for their vehicle detection system. Caltrans has their life cycle cost analysis procedures manual. Georgia DOT also have the life cycle cost analysis for their traffic asset management system. FHWA has several documents, including the performance measures and health index for ITS assets, the TMC performance monitoring, evaluation, and reporting, and TMC performance dashboards, which might be really interesting. If you're only going to look at one thing in that resource list, I would suggest looking at those performance dashboards. That might be very instructional for you. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and turn it over to John, who will talk about reporting on the condition and performance of TMS assets. John.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction, Les. I'm going to follow a similar process that Les did and bring up some questions and issues to consider when talking about reporting on the condition and performance of TMS assets. It requires an inventory and data specific to each asset. You've heard that in the previous presentations on inventory, what to collect and what you need to have. You need to recognize that our different processes may require different sources of data. And that's very true for condition versus performance measures. Monitoring and reporting on condition and performance of assets are really two different processes. And to make it more complicated, if you're reporting on the performance of your TMS system, that can be even more complex. So you need to make sure you clearly define what you're going to be monitoring and whether it's going to be the condition or the performance of the asset or whether it's performance of the overall system. Each process must or may have different needs for data, such as accuracy or frequency. You've heard that previously stated. Different processes may use and report information differently. So you've heard about dashboards, or you can have alarms in the case of an operational alert system. So you need to recognize that the process may use a different means of reporting. An analysis conducted may have different needs and requirements, such as when and from where. So measuring asset conditions on performance. Decision-making processes may need information specific to each asset or to asset tier. You may need to link the decision-making to specific data elements or performance measures or to thresholds. And the need will exist to verify the performance measures or data to make sure that data that may or may not be needed for each type of asset or tier or device. In other words, do the needs differ by manufacturer? So if you've got different manufactured type of items, you need to understand what may be required to report each one of those in a consistent format. Should functionality assessment of assets be considered when determining condition and performance of assets? I'm a strong advocate of continued functionality assessment, both in terms of reporting and in terms of managing of TMS assets. You also need to consider how your needed data may be used and reported. Is it an operating status? Is it a maintenance repair status needed? So you need to make sure you understand what you're reporting and what it's going to be used for. And how will data be collected, archived, accessed, and analyzed to meet the needs of different processes and decision-making that may use the asset data. So assessing asset conditions. Is there an expected condition for each asset for all conditions? For example, if there's rain or snow or no power, is the asset still expected to perform? That will then inform you whether you need to have auxiliary power or battery backup. But that's important. You need to set the expectation of what is expected from the asset so that you know what you can report and measure. Are performance thresholds or benchmarks needed for each asset, excuse me, or tier of assets? And how are those thresholds established and managed over time for an asset or a tier of assets? You need to ask, should questions change or thresholds change over time or vary for different conditions? Who is responsible for managing and monitoring that and deciding on whether a change should occur and the relevance of those values? So we all understand that the traffic is dynamic and the management of traffic is a dynamic practice. And as conditions change, should your thresholds change? Will changes in use, for example, maintenance versus real-time operations of the data and decision-making processes require different thresholds or measures or data sets to be collected and archived? So all questions that you need to address. So summarizing condition or performance of assets. How will performance information be summarized and used? You heard minute, you heard hourly, daily, periodically, or as needed. Will performance data be combined with similar assets or within a tier? Will it be beneficial to report on how a tier is performing versus individual assets, or do you need to do both? Will performance data be repackaged for future use? Are there other expected uses of performance data, such as planning or funding needs? And how will performance information be reported? Will it be reported in dashboards, tables, diagrams, spreadsheets, or files that you can query and access? And would mapping or visualization of the condition and performance information enhance the planning and decision-making process? So reporting condition and performance of assets. How will the reporting be used? Will it be real-time alerts? Is it historical data? Is it condition monitoring? Is it information that's going out to the public? Is it information that's used totally internally? Are there reporting requirements to use the data? Is it an operator's interface, or is the data information going to the public? Another question is, are there limitations on using the information? You heard this in an earlier presentation. Is some of the data proprietary or sensitive in nature? And when you're reporting information, particularly when you're reporting to the public, that's something that you're going to need to consider. Some systems will allow internal use of data, but would prohibit its use and dissemination to the public or to the public at large. Will reporting be internal or external, essentially? Is it going to be reported on a website or internal, for internal use only? And if a report will be external to the agency, are there agency protocols or concerns that need to be addressed before releasing it? Most agencies have policies with regard to releasing information, but with the emergence of more and more cameras and other kinds of data, that becomes extremely important to have a policy or guidance on how your agency is going to deal with that. Okay, some examples of reporting, and this happens to be a dashboard to report information, and it can be very useful for planning, condition reports, service of TMS metrics based on quarter performance or historical locations. Could be operational reports, indicating the operational status of assets. That's what this report you see in front of you. And I apologize if it's tough to read. This is actually an operations dashboard from Michigan DOT, their ITS asset management system, and it gives you a breakdown of the total number of assets by region, or you can do the statewide, and it gives you an indication of what the current conditions are. If you look to the right of the table with the little red, yellow, and green triangles, it'll tell you those are the priority assets, and there are 6 that are of critical priority that are currently on work order, and it gives you a work order status. Very effective. Michigan does some first echelon maintenance with their own technicians, but they use a lot of contracts to manage their ITS and TMS systems, and they use their asset management system to monitor and manage the contractor's performance. Another example from Michigan, this happens to be a map-based dashboard. This is very useful for the traffic technician in the traffic center to know what resources are available. But it's an interactive map where you can click on it and actually see what the problem is, what the asset is, what its condition is, and what its status of repair is. Michigan uses this system to not only know what their systems are that are up and down from a traffic management perspective, but in managing their contractor, they've got preset criteria based on the priority level for repair. And then the contractor's compensation is based on him meeting that criteria, and they track that using their asset management system. Other example, this is from Southern California, and we heard earlier about this happens to be from the I-15 Integrated Corridor Management System, and it provides accurate information. You need to know what your availability is of your various TMS assets in order to have active traffic management in a corridor management system. And this actually is a report that shows you what the current status is. It shows you the asset availability and what percent is, as well as the priority of that asset. And this is another dashboard example, again, relating to the I-15 Integrated Corridor Management System that shows where you can actually set or adjust or modify the parameters regarding how something is either queried or used or its importance. So just another example of reporting. And there's multiple examples out there. Good examples of successful practices. There are numerous ones out there, more than what's listed on the sheet here. And I would encourage you that the KC Scout Asset Management Plan that's jointly used by KDOT and MoDOT, and KC Scout is their traffic management the system across the two states. There's a risk-based, really neat risk-based management plan used by Colorado DOT. And then using life cycle cost analysis and asset management planning that Nevada DOT has put together. Tennessee DOT integrating agency IT into TMS asset management efforts. And again, we're giving accolades to Georgia DOT and using TMS asset health assessment and investing in operations planning decisions. Georgia DOT also does a neat job of doing return on investment analysis when programming TMS/ITS improvements as opposed to roadway or other more traditional highway improvements. And that's kind of an interesting approach there, because there's certainly a higher return on investment earlier in the game with ITS or TMS improvements. And then lastly, TMS asset condition information included in agency asset management programs that Pennsylvania DOT. Pennsylvania DOT has a completely integrated asset management program covering all the transportation assets, and it's carried over very healthily into the TMS asset category as well. Various resources, I don't know that I need to read through each of these for everybody, but several from FHWA, NCHRP, and asset management gap analysis tool that's been developed by AASHTO. So I would encourage you to avail yourselves of the resources. I will note that the previous slide where I talked about some best examples, several states have excellent presentations available on their websites. So if you just go in and search for ITS or TMS or asset management, you'll find some interesting presentations and programs that are out there. And with that, thank you for your time. And I'd now like to pass the baton to Lisa Burgess from Kimley Horn, who's going to provide a summary of the breakout session dialogue.
Great. Thank you, John. I'm going to share, actually I want to take a quick pause just to kind of see, we've gone through the first, our first session kind of highlighted 3 key areas when it comes to developing and maintaining an inventory, monitoring and assessing conditions, reporting condition and performance on the assets, and we saw a lot of really good examples. John or Nilu, is there an opportunity to maybe take a quick look at some of the chat questions to see if there's anything we want to talk about before we move into the summary?
Lisa, there is. We had a couple questions in the chat pod. One we'll cover at the end.
Okay.
But Anita Vandervalk had a great question about where can we find some of these resources. So we put in the chat or the discussion area a couple links to where we've got pages that NOCO has done a great job of setting up on managing TMS assets and resources. So the links are there where you can go to the two different pages, one on the overall management of TMS assets and one on developing and maintaining an inventory of TMS assets and resources. And the material from this webinar, the TRB Workshop, are located on those pages. But also, we're going to be adding links to all of the other national resources from Federal Highways or TRB through the NCHRP program. We'll be providing links to those and listing them there. And then it also allows for agencies or organizations to upload any examples that they would like to make available for others and their peers to access and use. And I'll give you an example. There's a great resource from the Utah DOT that's posted there. So I try to provide that link in the discussion area, but we'd encourage others to post more information. The two resources that were listed on previous slides, the TMC dashboard project, we had a number of resources identified as a part of that project. We also have another effort underway, TMS assets and resources by the TMC Pool Fund Study. And the contract team working in that effort has provided us the links to all of those resources. And we're in the process of getting all those resources and links posted to the NOCO web pages that were listed. So post and then come back, and we're hoping in the coming weeks we'll have most of those resources posted and available for others to use. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and highlight some of the feedback that we got from the breakout groups. So we did allocate a good amount of time as part of the January workshop to be able to divide participants into some different breakout groups, to be able to, talk in a little bit more detail across several key areas that we've been focusing on here this morning, provide us with some additional information on maybe some innovative practices, and just be able to really highlight what are some issues and some needs that agencies have. So we have participants were assigned to one of three breakout groups. So we formulated these groups based on the topics developing and maintaining an inventory of the TMS assets, monitoring and assessing conditions, reporting the conditions and performance, and we actually had a couple of smaller breakout groups within each one of these themes. So that way the groups were not an overwhelming size, and it really allowed for a lot of dialogue and very active participation. So we've gone through and summarized some of the feedback that we got from those breakout groups, and I'm going to highlight, some of the outcomes, many of which we've kind of already talked about as part of some of the earlier presenters. So the first group was focused on developing and maintaining an inventory of TMS assets. And we've talked about a lot of the different tools that agencies might need to be able to develop as well as maintain an asset inventory. And as we heard from some of the earlier presenters, a lot of this information is usually kept in a variety of different places. Whether it's a spreadsheet, sometimes some of that information is contained within TMS software. Other times it might be through plans or studies, and it tends to be in multiple different places and across multiple different groups within an agency. It's really important to go through and really look at how TMS asset management and asset and inventory tracking fits in with other department asset management activities. Oftentimes there are going to be some tools or some processes in place that are very well suited and very entrenched for more traditional assets, some of the pavement and bridges and signs. But when we start talking about TMS assets, these might not easily fit into some of those other established asset management processes. There was an important emphasis here when it comes to maintaining that inventory and how you store some of that data, how you can keep it updated, needing a configuration management plan to make sure that all of the activities that are needed are addressed in there, not just when a TMS asset was implemented, but how is it maintained, when is it replaced, how is it monitored. So there were some other ideas also that were presented in terms of how that information could be tracked, whether it's through some sort of a GIS type tool, whether it's by different serial numbers. So there were a lot of different different approaches to how different types of TMS assets are tracked and inventoried. So one of the tasks of the breakout groups was to share where are there some successful practices, who are doing things really well, or what are some innovative approaches. So John had mentioned, Nevada DOT has a pretty good system of, collecting, the data. They've got a good management plan, and a lot of it is linked to GIS coordinates to be able to get access to some of that inventory data. Minnesota DOT uses some different types of tracking processes. SunGuide, has a lot of that information available through some of those established dashboards. And we'll talk about some of the dashboards a little bit later on in the slides. There's a lot of different approaches here and some different successful practices. There was a couple of needs identified about how do we provide the right training so that people are tracking and inventorying assets in the same consistent way. Maybe there's also an opportunity to look at how can TMS assets and devices self-report issues? How can we automate maybe some of those processes? And we'll touch on that as part of the third breakout group. So some of the existing or resources that are there, we wanted to ask the breakout participants, where are there some resources you currently use, and what resources do agencies need? What kind of resources and guidance is needed to help improve this process? So there's a few items identified here. The AASHTO Transportation Asset Management Portal, which is an established tool which may have some information when it comes to TMS assets, but I think some of the resources that we're going to see here, may need to be revisited or updated and expanded so that it could include, sort of the wide range of TMS assets that we're talking about. There's some resources there through NCHRP, and this group really identified the need for new resources and maybe some guidance on how do you plan for obsolescence. It's not even just a matter of repair and replace, but what happens when certain types of assets or certain functions of assets are obsolete because there's a new technology or a new way of doing things out there. So that was one important area that the group identified when it came to developing and maintaining that inventory of different TMS assets. So our second group was then focused on monitoring and assessing different TMS assets and their conditions. And Les presented a lot of some of the key issues to consider and some of the current practices. Very much a focus on the data aspect. And is there a data management plan? Is there a plan for how that data is to be stored, accessed, and used? What are some of the responsibilities for making sure that data is kept up to date? Les also shared a little bit about some of the different condition rating systems and thresholds. This was something that was really echoed within a couple of the groups that I was listening in on during our breakout sessions, was that different types of assets are going to have different senses of urgency, and they're definitely going to have different performance standards. Some may have very different performance standards depending on what type of an asset it is. It goes back to that tiered system that we have been, or the tiered approach that we have been talking about earlier. Also, when it comes to monitoring and assessing the TMS asset conditions, oftentimes this falls to many different types of staff. It can be very tempting to put a lot of focus with the TMC and the operations staff, since they are the ones that can visually see or interact with the systems that are talking to a lot of these assets. They are the staff that is actively using some of the central system software and other types of operating systems. But the reality is that, that oftentimes this responsibility is spread across multiple different groups. So just having a good understanding and maybe making sure that, specific tasks are assigned and the emphasis is there on the importance of this activity. Who within the agency can help advocate for an asset inventory and good asset management practices and processes? Who is going to be responsible for managing data access and how to allow different permissions to those who need to use it? So I think there's a whole host of different considerations when it comes to all of the different aspects of how assets are monitored, how their condition is evaluated, and how their performance is assessed. So some of the feedback that we heard, there are more and more types of different commercial off-the-shelf software packages that can help with monitoring and assessing. The Minnesota DOT was cited as a really good example of that. Washington State DOT has some database and software that helps staff there to both manage and report on some of the TMS inventory, condition information, operational status, those kinds of things. Pennsylvania was highlighted as another good example of some asset management software that helps the agency to really identify current status, condition, and helps to report on some of those different asset conditions. One of the questions that was asked in one of the breakout groups is, would partnerships with public agencies be considered sort of a best practice? And I think what we heard from many of the agency participants is that, especially as we start looking regionally with different TMS operating programs, asset management is not the responsibility of just one agency. There may be multiple cities or transit agencies involved. How can some of that coordination be facilitated across multiple operating agencies for some of this important asset reporting? Some of the existing or needed resources, again, there have been some emphasis recently here on some of the TMC performance monitoring and evaluation that's got some emphasis there on some of the asset monitoring functions. We've seen a lot of recent examples on some of the TMC performance dashboards, which include both some of the TMC operating functions, but also, many of them also include some of the different asset information. I think FHWA's got some information available through some of the performance measures and health index for ITS assets. But there was identified here a need for, needing some partnerships, maybe with assistance and partnerships with different universities. How can maybe some of those university resources help in terms of being able to update some of the information, help with some of the, maybe some of the reporting, help with some of those monitoring functions, particularly if some of the DOT groups may be too busy, that university could be a good, maybe a hub for different department activities. So I thought that was one really interesting and helpful suggestion. So our third group was focused on some of the reporting TMS asset conditions and performance. And I think this is one area that has gotten a lot of focus lately, just because I think there is an increased emphasis on dashboards, on data visualization. How can we really turn this asset information and status data into very helpful information for planning, operations, and future system operating activities? So we've got, John presented some really good examples here on some of how agencies go about monitoring and reporting on conditions and performance of different types of assets. whether they may be a traffic signal system, maybe a communications network. Some of those will have different emphasis areas in terms of how they are monitored, how they are reported, what kinds of frequency does that reporting need to happen. A very important, this third bullet here, a very important topic across this breakout group and just in the community in general is how do we now present this data to leadership? How do we present this information in a way that really highlights the importance and the need for continued focus on TMS asset management? Leadership is one very important audience, but there are multiple audiences that kind of use and rely on this information. As we've heard from some of the presenters, oftentimes some of the maintenance contractors, this data is used to support some of those contractor activities and contractor prioritization. So I think just focusing on how this data is going to be used and what kind of a format it needs to be in to support different audiences will be an important topic going forward. Again, how to deal with new technology that replaces or duplicates older assets. What types of condition information do we need from that? What new information maybe are new types of technologies able to tell us that we didn't know about before about the condition of our systems? And again, the user experience of viewing and working with different data. And I think we've got some really good examples and more emerging all the time of how that data maybe needs to be packaged, accessed, how it's utilized by different audiences. So some successful practices that were highlighted as part of the breakout discussion. Maryland Transportation Authority does a great job with some of the different ITS device metrics and how they report some of that performance data. John mentioned the Colorado DOT and their risk-based asset management plan. Tennessee DOT actually looks to integrate some of the, they put a real focus on some of the information technology assets into their department-wide, asset management efforts, which I think is a really important step. And then a couple of examples again from Pennsylvania. This was one of the breakout groups that really emphasized the need for, when it comes to what help do we need, what guidance do we need, really leaning on the systems and maybe some of those automation strategies to help identify asset condition information, diagnostics, current operating status. So rather than relying on perhaps manual processes, which I know many agencies use to be able to go through and just manually check and verify the status of different assets, where can we be leaning a little bit more on some of those automated processes? So a couple of different angles on that, needing the ability to automatically sort of diagnose failures or different types of failures, and again, automating maybe how some of that information is reported. So this would really greatly help the efficiency of an asset management program. Some of the other tools, many of these very recent, the signal system asset management, connecting transportation asset management to operations, recent publication there through NCHRP. Some of the other tools through maybe AASHTO or integrating some of those asset management into the planning process, they may need to be reviewed and perhaps updated to see what aspects of TMS asset management could be integrated into both of those tools and documents. So this is a very quick summary of the breakout groups. I thought it was a very lively discussion. We had a great cross-section of agency participants, some of the different technology developers, academia. It was a really good cross-section of perspectives within each one of those breakout group topics. Right. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Greg Krieger, who's going to help us talk through what do we do with all this information? How are we going to use it? Greg?
Greg, are you there?
Greg?
You may be on mute.
I can see him here. I did unmute him, so I'm not sure why we're not hearing him.
Greg, one last call, see if you're available. Otherwise, I'll jump in, and as soon as Greg can get a voice connection, we can let him jump in.
And feel free, if you can hear us,
Okay.
to type something in the chat pod, Greg, so we can troubleshoot.
All right, well, let me jump forward in the slide presentation and cover for Greg, and when he's able to join and get voice back, we'll let him jump in and replace me on the final session we want to cover before we open it up for questions and answers with participants. We want to cover sort of the action planning and the next steps with that the lead sponsor and co-sponsors of the workshop obtained feedback from the workshop participants and drew a consensus on that after the January workshop at TRB. Some of the activities, what the purpose of putting this together was really identify what other opportunities the co-sponsors could work on, what may be priorities that they could pursue, and could they align and engage, again, among the different TRB committees and outside organizations on activities to continue work with volunteers that can pull other disciplines and experts together to advance and hopefully get more information out to other audiences versus just working within one TRB committee as an example and not engaging a wider audience. And the perspective is to help stimulate and advance more activities in 2021 and 2022. Possibly 2023. And I apologize for some of these slides where some of the formatting, it's not fitting within the slide, but somehow when we submitted our final version, we missed and the format jumped into the headers on some of these slides. So we will fix this and we'll repost them. Greg, are you still available?
I'm back.
Perfect.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, sir.
I had an issue. Which slide are we on? My
we are
presentation
on the
slide.
We're on the action planning for proposed outcomes and the first list with number 1.
Gotcha. I apologize. The presentation died on my phone, but I've got the audio. So moving on then, yeah, preparing the summary of where we are is really a critical component of documenting what happened at the workshop and documenting any responses. So as we mentioned earlier today, and as from the presentation that John mentioned, the outcomes from the January workshop are available, and those resources are available, and then this document or this presentation will be available as well for you to go back, review, and to share with your colleagues back in the office. Our goal is to look forward to 2022 to conduct a follow-up workshop. We're looking at topics for that, a few different suggestions there are on the screen. Assessing the capability and maturity, as well as planning and programming resources for the next generation of agencies' traffic management systems. So if you have ideas or thoughts on those, please let us know, and we'll actually have the call for volunteers here shortly within this part of the presentation. The third is to advance activities to foster a global dialogue to engage organizations. So as we'll see in 2 slides here, the number of organizations that co-sponsor this workshop is significant, and we want to continue that. We don't want this to be a presentation of just the ITS committee or just the Freeway Operations Committee. So the Freeway Ops Committee has led this for a number of years. The ITS committee is taking the lead on it this year with John's strong support. We want to continue having not just TRB support and committee support, but support from the various organizations and entities in the transportation community in the U.S. as well as internationally. So we want to make sure that we continue with that. And again, we'll talk to that a little bit here later with a follow-up bullet on the next slide. We want to continue to share information, number 4. The resources are on the TMS portal, and I believe, and John can correct me here, that's where the document from the lessons learned and the outcomes of the workshop were from the January meeting, but we want to continue with this process as we move forward of documenting and sharing information and highlighting the successful practices. Moving on to the next slide. We want to encourage public agencies to join and contribute funds to the TMC Pooled Fund Study. The TMC Pooled Fund Study is a valuable resource for all of us to be able to use to document what's happening and to be able to put resources towards what's programs towards the future. So the TMC Pooled Fund Study, for those of you who are members, thank you very much. And for those of you who aren't, we can get the links, but please definitely look into joining the Pooled Fund Study because a lot of very valuable information comes out of that. Moving on to number 6, we want to conduct an international symposium on this. So hopefully 2023, the world will be back to a new relative normal again. And our plan is to have an international symposium on this. Our colleagues at Austria Tech have offered to host, so we would like to take them up on that. And we're looking at the summer of 2023 in Austria to be able to share practices on challenges as well as discuss resources and describing processes and products, really taking this conversation that we've had at TRB over the past couple of years and moving it forward internationally as well. And then, lastly is to establish partnerships. So we want to make sure that we're collaborating and jointly, we're collaborating resources and using those joint resources that we have to be able to move the research and to be able to move the program forward. And we want to prioritize needs for research. As a TRB workshop, our goal is to put out research and research statements and be able to generate research ideas and papers and such that we can publish, that we can present, and that we can talk to that continues to move the program forward. So you can see there's a number of different research options that we're looking for to be able to move forward on. And then in closing, and then I'll go through this, and John, I think I'll turn it back over to you after this, slide 71. There's a video, there's a link to the video on YouTube. I don't believe we're going to show that as part of this webinar, but a number of the different agencies and entities that are actively participating put together a brief video expressing their support for this and the program. So please take a few minutes and click on that YouTube link. And if you're interested, if you've got feedback on the workshop today, if you've got feedback on the workshop in January, please reach out to any of the colleagues here that have their contact information shown and offer to help, offer to support for the 2022 conference and beyond. And if you have research ideas and statements, again, this is the email list, and we talk on a very regular basis. So if you reach out to any one of us, you'll be able to reach out to all of us. So with that, John, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you very much for all of you for attending today and for all of you putting in your hard work to organize the session.
Greg, thank you for that summary. That was fantastic. We appreciate the energy and your support and commitment by the ITS committee for being a sponsor for this year, the lead sponsor for the workshop this year, and we're looking forward to being the lead sponsor for the workshop in 2022. We did have a couple questions. One of the questions in the chat box was, can we download the presentation and from today's workshop, and it is available for download. So if you can't see it here, it will also be posted on the NOCO webpage where there's a page for this actual webinar. So it'll be posted there. Also, like we mentioned earlier at the beginning of the workshop or at the webinar, the summary from the TRB workshop in 2021 is available to download. So the great summary that Lisa provided it has more information about the actual responses from each of the breakout groups on the key topics that were covered, along with the information that Greg covered in his summary is in that the summary document and can be downloaded. So I'd encourage you to download those, use those, and if you've got others within your organization, your agency, company that may have an interest in these topics or benefit from the information, we thank you for being a leader and sharing that with them to help raise their awareness and understanding of this information that's been pulled together, and hopefully it will help them. We did have one comment in the chat box from Peter Rafferty. Traffic management systems, TMCs, ITS, ATMS, does it matter? Is there a difference between those terms, concepts, and ideas? And I'll call on Mr. Les Jacobson. He's working on a project for us, and we're going through our process internally in Federal Highways to get formal review and approval of the publication, so it's taking a while. But as a part of that document, Les has gone through and explained and developed some graphics, of which a couple graphics appeared in the first presentation that Pete Marshall went through about what is a traffic management system. So with that transition, I'll call on Les. Now he's had a chance to unmute his phone. If he could answer and provide some context about traffic management system and how that differs from ITS, ATMS, etc.
So really the traffic management system, and especially as we're starting to define the next generation of traffic management system, really looks at a wide range of systems that are specifically tied to traffic management. So it's a subset, if you will, of ITS. It doesn't include some of the other aspects like transit management or those sorts of things, parking management, etc. It really focuses on any traffic management system, so we could think of anything that manages traffic on a freeway, on an arterial network, those sorts of things. And so we've categorized kind of the different components, both on the physical side and the logical side of traffic management systems. John, did you want me to go into any more detail, or is that kind of what you were looking for?
Oh, I think that's fantastic, and I think as it relates to the subject we're talking about here today for managing assets and resources for a traffic management system, the concepts, principles, tools, best, successful practices that we've identified would also be applicable as they may relate to a parking management system, a weather management system, a traveler information system. So all those other assets and systems that an agency may have or an organization may have in place in addition to a traffic management system, they would all be applicable to those as well. Peter, hopefully that answers your question. Otherwise, feel free to put another question in the chat box, and we can flush that out for folks. One thing I would encourage people, we've done a great job, the NOCO has done a great job of putting material up, and we've got the traffic management system portal established, and we've probably got about 15 different resource areas where we've identified for people to post information, not only to post the resources they have, be it a policy, a procedure, any type of report or analysis they've got a document on. NOCO's built those pages in those resource areas to allow people to upload things for others to use. So I really encourage people, if you've got a document, please, if you're too busy, have somebody on your staff post a resource or provide a link to where it may be on your existing website so other people can get access and use that. We're going to do the best we can with the TMC Pool Fund Study projects and a federal highway project that we have, where you identify publicly available resources to get them on the NOCO website with links to those resources so people can get access and find that information. Because we really think, like Anita appropriately pointed out in her presentation, boy, we flagged a lot of great examples, but how can we get them out to people so they can get access and use them? So we're gonna work on that and do that, but we hope others can encourage posting and sharing with your peers around the country. Any other comments? I'll call on a couple of the speakers. Any other observations or comments or things that they've found in working with their customers around the globe on these issues? And we'll go in the order that we had speakers with. Pete, Marshall, any thoughts or comments you have?
Yeah, one thing I could add to that is that you look at agencies. We gave a couple of good examples, but more often than not, the asset management side of things is sort of I wouldn't say a lower priority than the day-to-day operations, right? And sometimes it gets overlooked. And I would just say that it's harder and it takes more time to do it right than it seems like it would, and that's the focus for why we would have in this session today, to just bring awareness to it. But yeah, I would say don't overlook it and try to make it a priority.
No, it's a good comment, Pete. Thank you. It's a great observation. It's oftentimes it's how do you get started, and once you do something, how do you integrate it into your day-to-day practices? So like as Dan mentioned in his presentation, you develop an inventory. We need to make sure it is a part of that effort to develop that inventory. It's integrated into day-to-day practices. So it's seamless, and there's not another new funded activity is needed to make sure it's updated, but it's built into everybody's day-to-day roles and responsibilities. So that inventory is accessible and it's up to date, and people can access and use it. So that's a great reminder. Go on, Dan Lukasik, you've worked on a couple resources for the TMC Pool Fund Study related to assets, and you're working on a new one that we've got underway with the Pool Fund Study and inventorying and documenting and configuring the inventory of traffic management system assets. Any thoughts or comments you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think, John, the one that really stood out to me based on some of the discussions and interviews that we've had with various agencies is to really use the KISS model. I think there's a tendency sometimes, especially with inventorying, I'm going to collect every piece of information that I humanly can. I'm going to gather, 500 pieces of data on every device. When you make it too hard, I think then it's hard to maintain. So just focus on really what you need. Keep it simple. Don't overdo it. And then people will use it and focus on the importance of why you're doing it. But there is a tendency sometimes with inventories to maybe overdo it. But maybe just focus on just what you need to function well and operate well, and then maybe you can expand from there.
Oh, it's fantastic. Good comment. If we've got an idea of how the devices that we need are operating for day-to-day operation, and we're able to develop more of an inventory and a history of their uptime, their reliability, and is that a driver that people can use over time to make more informed decisions on allocation of resources, be it maintenance, be it repairs, or are we looking at reallocating, if we can do a better job with maintenance or repair over time by monitoring and managing these assets, will that free up, resources to reallocate within an organization to more day-to-day operations or more planning or more enhancements to the system capabilities. So I hope long-term that will be the case, where more focus on asset management and all of the resources that are available to the TMS to be able be smarter with how we allocate our resources, and it can allow us to do more with less in the future. So with that, Les Jacobson, any thoughts, comments you'd have?
Well, kind of on a parallel track to what Dan talked about, I think it's really important as you think about the performance metrics and also reporting on assets is to not try to go overboard. Really look at what the key performance indicators are and report condition and performance that's really tailored to the audience, and make sure you're not providing either too detailed information for some or not providing what other audiences are really going to want to see and know.
Oh, it's fantastic. Thank you, Les. John Benda, any thoughts, great examples that you wanted to highlight in addition to what you covered already?
Well, I would like to just second what Les said, that you really need to know when you're setting up reporting, and you really need to identify what your audience is and what you're trying to accomplish. Reporting internally is going to be totally different, and what you need to operate your system than the information that goes out from that. The other thing I would recommend is that you need to focus on not only reporting of assets and asset performance and managing your assets, and I'm a strong advocate of asset management, but also don't forget to report on how your TMS impacts your TSMO initiatives and other transportation performance in the region. We all know that measuring something, it gets done. Well, if performance works, it gets funded. So don't forget to highlight that which is important to the region. If it's crash management or incident management or other TSMO, wherever TMS supports that should be reported as a success as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, John. Lisa, you did a great job during the workshop, well, before the workshop, setting up and helping to frame all the material to engage the participants. You did a fantastic job of summarizing all that came together at that workshop. Any other thoughts and perspectives based on your experience with working with people around the country?
Yeah, John, thank you. I think, and what we heard this through some of the breakout groups is, when agencies are starting from scratch, it's just like sort of, where do you start? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it, leveraging maybe an enterprise-wide tool? I think going forward, there's a great opportunity to look at how can tools and processes be developed that make it easier for agencies to implement TMS asset management programs. If there's a good tool and a good process and it makes it very efficient, I think that agencies will be more likely to really institutionalize that and stick with it. So I think we heard that through some of the breakout group feedback, as well as how can we get help from the assets themselves in terms of automating some of that reporting, automating some of the diagnostics and status. So I think going forward, we'll probably see a lot more of those themes in some of the recommended research and hopefully some of the TRB committee activities.
Good. Thank you. We had a couple of questions come in, one from Matt Junick, who helped with the workshop. Great question. How does crowdsourced data fit into the realm? Is it something that needs to be managed but not necessarily as an asset? I'll throw that out to the panel members. Anybody would like to volunteer to provide some perspectives on Matt's question? Pete, could I call on you? Is crowdsourced data an actual asset, or is that something that just needs to be managed along with other data within the traffic management system?
I was wondering what crowdsourced data was referred to in this data, because to me there's two different things. There's things like ways that is sort of an ad hoc way of collecting things, and then there's more organized like INRIX and HERE data that comes from the outside. Is one of those the main point of this question, or am I missing? Am I not understanding? If you want to answer, Matt, I'll take a shot at it. I mean, if we're looking at INRIX or HERE type data that you're using to display on your map, you're using it for response plans. I mean, that's definitely an asset. I don't know if I would call it crowdsourced, but it's kind of crowdsourced because it comes from individual location data in the first place, right? So you're likely paying for that. So that is likely to be considered an asset that you have to manage, because you could be using it in multiple different places or shipping it to someplace else. Like if you have a third-party, 511 provider or website or app provider, you may be sharing that data with them. So that definitely is an asset that should be managed along with your other data streams.
Yeah, I think, Matt, if you see in the chat box, provided additional information on his question on ways, how do you manage the data quality, and should it be treated like an asset?
Yeah, I'm not the biggest Waze fan, so I'm not sure that I would consider it an asset. I might consider it a data point that you could might call your attention to something, but in terms of treating it like an asset, I'm not sure that I would, but one of the other folks, feel free to weigh in.
I could probably jump in, John. This is Dan. I mean, Waze data gets consumed today. Often, I think the primary thing is that we get event information. We get knowledge that some sort of maybe accident has happened. Now, to me, I don't really see that data as an asset. It's more a piece of information, but there are some data quality issues. Sometimes its location is not accurate, and sometimes when it's cleared or when it started isn't accurate. But I would say for other data, like INRIX data, HERE data, Verizon data, that's all kind of crowdsourced data that comes from probe data and feedback from cellular devices and other mobile devices. That data kind of replaces your traditional vehicle detector, and you do track the vehicle detector and the accuracy of that data as an asset. So it is an interesting question on whether you would now treat this data as an asset, but maybe you should, because it is something you would have in a database somewhere. You use it, and sometimes the data isn't super accurate. So
thanks, Dan.
Yeah,
I
guess,
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Les, any thoughts or perspectives you want to add on that question?
I think very similar to what Dan had to say. I think it really depends, I think, on what the type of data is. That's one thing that Pete mentioned, and the difference between reported incident location data and the accuracy of that compared to if it's going to be travel time data that's gathered through any of the third-party providers. I think it is important to try and track the data and have some sort of idea of how accurate it is. It may be difficult to do that, but I think that's pretty important so that you can put some sort of kind of reliability and accuracy measures to it. So I think it's an interesting idea as well. I do think, if possible, it would be good to kind of treat the whole data as an asset. I don't know how much you could really break it down, though.
Yeah, that was sort of my perspective from how do you package and provide resources on managing traffic management system assets, where I would see the devices, the technology whatever tools you may have to collect, compile, monitor the condition of a particular asset. And then as a part of that, you need to save the information on that asset. You need to manage that data. You need to configure it so that those data management practices that you apply to the asset management information may be similar or very close to the data management practices you'd have where you manage all of the data in your data subsystem for your traffic management system. Similar, the configuration management and the processes and controls you put in place to configure and make sure the data or information is accurate on your assets. You may apply those to your data subsystem as well. So I think there's some related practices, processes, and tools that would be applicable to data, as where on whatever issue it's trying to focus on within a system. But Jim Hunt had a great question. I think the role of planning was touched on, but are there any examples with MPOs taking a more proactive role in asset management or any agency planning shops? Do you have any thoughts on what some of the initial first steps may be for the planning partners? Throw that out to the audience. Greg Krieger or John Benda, you want to take a shot at that? I haven't called that.
Yeah, let me, this is John. I know that SANDAG, the San Diego Council of Governments, so the MPO for the Imperial and San Diego counties in Southern California, is very actively involved in terms of overall traffic planning and visions and managing and developing big data. And so they would be an MPO to go to talk in terms of an agency that's taking more active role in asset management. They haven't solved the problem yet, but they are focused on it. If that
Greg,
helps.
anybody else have, that helps. Greg, anybody else have any thoughts or perspectives?
I think this is Lisa, I think it's a very interesting maybe research question. Where are maybe MPOs taking a pretty active role? What are they doing? How are they partnering? I think it's a great question, Jim, and we might have some good examples that we're just not out there that we're just not aware of in terms of what that role is and maybe what it could be going forward.
Yeah, I think in SANDAG's case, they view themselves as kind of the custodial or significant involvement in terms of the mega data that's coming in, and so they're working with District 11, Caltrans, and others in terms of what the next iteration of data systems might be for the region.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if actual asset information or that inventory of assets and what tiers they think it may be appropriate to compile, save information on, and track, look at condition over time, and then as you try to look at how that may impact the allocation of resources, be it maintenance, be it repairs, be it device replacement, how that information was used in that decision making, right? And oftentimes, if you've got a TSMO plan or a congestion mitigation plan at a regional level that an MPO is involved in, it'd be interesting to see if condition of assets get integrated into those TSMO or congestion mitigation plans. As we've seen a lot of great information on performance, right? Be it traveler performance, facility performance. But like Jim mentioned, I have not seen, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, the condition of the assets, which really gets to the point, Les was covering in his presentation. does that really set the stage for us of, do we need more money for maintenance? Do we need more money for repairs if we're going to positively influence the condition, the reliability and condition of assets? Okay. Good question. Any other questions that people may have? Otherwise, Greg, I will call on you last. I'll thank the NOCO staff one more time for conducting this, but I'll turn it over to you if you want to provide concluding remarks, as you are the lead sponsor for the workshop in this past January and the lead sponsor for the workshop coming up in 2022. And you covered the summary and next steps activities. If you want to provide any concluding thoughts.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the NOCO staff for all the work you've done in getting this organized. Now, I would just conclude with the request, or the key word, which is engage. As we heard from those questions, those last couple of questions, it was a little bit of stump the panelists, but at the same time, these are the experts. So if you have questions, if you have thoughts on TMS asset management, this is the group to engage. We look forward to your comments and your questions, and we want you to be willing to ask those, and the experts are here. But at the same time, we want you engaged as well on a daily basis and participating in the group. So as we're planning the next meeting, we look forward to others working with us and bringing new perspectives and new ideas and new innovations forward to find out ways that we can all learn from each other. So that's the goal, is we want to learn from each other, but we can't do that if we're not talking to each other. So please get engaged, send questions, volunteer to participate in the event next year and in the international event the year beyond, and let's see how we can continue to work and learn together from one another. So with that, thank you all very much for your time. John, thank you for your leadership in putting this on for the past few years, and we look forward to the continuing conversation.
Have a great day, everybody. Awesome.